Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Michelle Anderson. I spent 2 decades working in equine media, and I currently create content and help veterinarians and businesses connect with horse owners through my consulting business, Cadence Marketing and Media. I'm a trail rider, dressage rider, and an at-home horse keeper.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and a pony club mom.
Claire and I collaborated for years when I was the editor of an equine publication, and she was one of our regular contributors. We'd finish work, but we always had more to talk about. New products, new research, and our own horses. This podcast is an extension of those conversations. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding and caring for their own horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. While I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode.
Today, I'm joined by our podcast producer, Jill Jackson. Jill, it's great to have you on this side of the microphone.
Thanks so much for giving me a chance. Longtime producer, first-time guest, host.
Oh, you're going to be great. Jill and I are horse friends that go way back, about 20 years, I think, and we're always talking horses, probably every day. We talk about her challenges of keeping her 3 easy keeper horses at home on pasture, and meanwhile, I'm trying to manage the challenges of keeping my horses boarded in the heat.
We do talk a lot about horses. Claire, you just got back from accompanying your daughter and her pony to Kentucky for the United States Pony Club National Championships. How did it go?
Yeah, it was an amazing trip, and some of our regular listeners will know that I've been gearing up for this for a while, and when we had Max Corcoran on, I was stealing all her little tips and tricks and wondering if I was going to get everything packed into a trunk and actually get it all there. We managed to get it there. Somehow I managed to get it in. My big trick was putting everything in a grooming tote and then wrapping it with cling wrap so that I could turn it on its side to put it in my tack trunk. I was quite pleased with myself for that little hack, so I'll share that with people. And that way I can put a lot of little things in that grooming tote and it didn't fall out when I turned it on its side in the tack trunk. But the pony traveled really well, got off the other end even fresher and fitter than I was expecting him. And we had fabulous weather. It wasn't as hot as I thought it was going to be. And my daughter and her team had a really amazing experience. So yeah, it's going to be one of those life memories, I think.
It's so exciting. As somebody that was in Pony Club, you were in Pony Club as a kid. We all know how much fun it is and the camaraderie from those experiences. And if anybody needs help learning how to pack a lot of stuff into very small spaces, Claire's your go-to. I feel like we should put pictures up on the Facebook page of not only the ponies packing, but Claire is also a master packer of her own clothes.
That is true. When we travel to Europe, like my husband's mandated about, 8 years ago now, that we were not checking any luggage. And so I tend to go back to visit family for 3 or 4 weeks at a time and haven't checked a bag in the last 8 years, except at Christmas. At Christmas, if we go back, we do check a bag. But yes, I can pack for a 3 or 4 week trip and carry on only.
Which is just amazing. Every time I see it, I'm always amazed that you can do that. And I applaud you for living such a simplistic 6-week trip.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't work if we didn't have a washing machine. I'll give you that. But
True.
If you have access to washing machines, it makes it easier.
So you were gone for 10 days, and the reason that we're having this episode today is because when you got home, your own horse, who stayed in Arizona while you were gone, didn't look the greatest when you got back.
Yeah, that's true. And I don't know, it's funny, right? When you see horses every day, sometimes I think you miss things. And so maybe there were some little things that were there before I left. But certainly when I got back, I was a little bit surprised. I mean, we're in a fabulous barn, and the barn owner was in contact with me while I was gone and let me know that he wasn't eating everything up the way that he had before we left. And he and the pony live in adjoining stalls with runs on the back. And my guy is not the bravest soul in the world. And I think really missed my daughter's pony. I like to think he missed me as well. Hopefully he missed me too. But yeah, he definitely missed my daughter's pony. And so I think there was a certain amount of separation anxiety there and stress from that. And he wasn't eating everything. It was also really hot while we were gone, like continuously over 110, I think pretty much every day we were gone. And I'm out there every day. When I'm out there, I groom him. I wash him off after he works. He's a black bay. And so I got back and he had really started to fade quite badly. And that's probably partly because he wasn't getting a deep groom every day to get that sweat out of his coat. And sweat is slightly acidic. And if you leave it in the coat, it contributes to the bleaching. So I came back, he just looked a bit sort of moth-eaten, really. He gets hives from the bugs and poor guy. And so, yeah, I was just kind of like, oh my gosh, what happened to you while I was gone? You don't look brilliant, I'll be honest. So yes, I was kind of sort of left with what am I going to do about this?
Well, and I think people generally think more about weight loss in the winter, but it's not uncommon for performance horses to lose weight over the summer, right?
Yeah, it's very true. And especially in our hotter areas, personally, living in Arizona, I always think of our summer is probably more like your winter. You're in Iowa, right? So, I mean, you have the really harsh winters. We have really harsh summers. And so it's not uncommon for horses here to drop weight, either because of the heat stress, but also because of flies, stomping flies all the time. I think we talked about that in a previous episode where we talked about flies stomping. Obviously, they're burning calories all day if they're stomping, can really knock weight off horses. And we're recording this at the end of July. And so to your point about performance horses, a lot of horses, for example, in your area and over the majority of the country are solidly in the thick of their competition season. And obviously competition season means road trips and show stress. And, and you might not be 110, but you have really high humidity. So that adds to heat stress. So really, I think this year especially, I feel like everywhere has been dealing with heat stress this summer. The last 3 weeks have been really hot. And so it's hard on horses. So yeah, I mean, horses do lose weight in the summer, especially the performance horses that have the added stress of traveling and competition.
And we still have several more months to go before we're going to cool off and before the show season, at least for this part of the country, is going to start winding down when yours is starting to wind up. But it is only July, almost August, and we're still going to have probably 8 more weeks of this, 2 more months.
Yeah. I mean, and then you've got end of season championships, right? So you and I both do dressage. I mean, I know we have our USDF and USCF regional championships are in September and early October, and those are out of state. So those are long trips and obviously the biggest competitions of the season for a lot of horses. So yes, I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done, a lot of traveling to be done, and at least 4 to 6 more weeks of hot weather.
It can be challenged to keep performance horses at ideal weight through the whole season. And even if they are maintaining their weight, sometimes they start to lose their edge. So today we thought we'd have a conversation about maintaining performance horses through the stresses of the season. So let's start with, why do performance horses lose weight in the summer?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just touched on that a little bit. I mean, with the travel, with the stress, and I think it's really worth, just re-emphasizing those things, right? We have some really interesting research that shows now that travel stress changes the horse's microbiome, that bacterial population in their hindgut. And they don't even have to travel for that long. And it can take up to a week for that to kind of get back to normal again. So traveling with our horses really impacts their GI tract and, so stress. But, the main thing about weight loss, the simplest reason for weight loss is that if you're consuming less calories than you're burning, you'll lose weight, right? I mean, that's just simple energetics. So in its simplest form, weight loss is the result of not consuming enough calories for the lifestyle that you're living.
Well, and when you speak about the gut health and the biome, I live with it every time I put my horse in the trailer for every single show, because he comes out of the trailer and within 30 minutes, and you've helped me with this, that he has diarrhea.
Right.
And he has it for the entire show, for the entire weekend, and usually for at least 2 to 3 weeks once we come back from a show. And obviously that's really stressful on him, and it's stressful for the owner trying to figure out how to counteract that and keep them comfortable so that doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. We work with a lot of horses that have loose manure, whether it's because of travel or just performance stress or whatever it is, that is a tricky one.
So you came back from Kentucky, you see your horse does not look great. Where do you start? Because I think for most of us horse owners, we want to do whatever we can to make our horses look and feel great. But what method do you use to actually figure out what he needs or what he's missing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, in his case, it wasn't an issue necessarily of lack of calories. I mean, he was being fed ample calories. So the main reason for his weight loss was separation anxiety and then him not eating anything. So it was lack of calories, not because he wasn't being fed enough calories, but because he wasn't eating them, because he was worried and pacing and just not a happy chap. He wasn't actually being worked while I was gone. He had the 10 days off and he was turned out on pasture. So you'd think he actually would have gained weight. So you really have to kind of strategically look at what is going on with this horse, big picture, right? Step back, like, has the workload increased? So for example, if you're a junior rider and you're not in school in the summer, oftentimes your horse's workload will go up because now you have all the free time in the world and you can ride 6 days a week. And maybe when you're in school, you're only riding 3 days a week, right? That workload has gone up, or maybe the intensity of the workload has gone up. Instead of just a quick 30 minutes after school, it's more like an hour every time you're riding. Or maybe you compete once a month and then in the summer, the show circuit kicks up and now you're competing every other week or whatever. So you have to kind of look back and think, what has really changed? Has the horse's work level actually increased and we kind of missed it and didn't pay attention to it and we didn't change the diet, in which case maybe that is actually a lack of calories issue. Maybe you were diligent and you did increase the diet as the workload increased and the horse is still losing weight. So is it then an issue with shipping stress, show stress? Is it heat stress? Like, I don't think we think about heat stress very much. There's a fair amount of research in other livestock species, especially pigs. Pigs are really sensitive to heat stress and does really bad things to the intestinal tract lining. Like, heat stress will actually cause the intestinal lining to start breaking down. And so obviously, if you've got inflammation and breakdown occurring in your small intestine, then you're not going to be able to digest and absorb the diet that you're feeding your horse as well. And so you may be putting all the right things in the bucket and in the hay bin, but the horse isn't able to digest it properly because maybe the gut lining is not secreting enzymes properly, or maybe it's not able to absorb things properly because there's some inflammation there due to heat stress. You won't be able to utilize that diet. And what we often do as owners is, if we're already feeding a performance feed, we say, well, let's just feed more performance feed. But if the underlying issue is integrity of that gut, just throwing more hard feed at it isn't actually going to solve the problem. It might actually make it worse. Something we don't think about, I think, is electrolyte balance, right? That can be really important. Thinking about where your calories are coming from, right? Are the calories mostly coming from hay? Maybe it's really hot and your horse is generating lots of internal body heat through that fermentation process of digesting the hay. And maybe we need to actually get a little bit more hard feed in the diet. And while trying to maximize forage, maybe if there's more calories needed, feeding more hay actually might not be the solution in that situation. Pasture quality, right? I don't think we think about that sometimes, but the quality of your pasture drops off in sort of July, August. The rate of growth slows down, especially if you're in an area. I know the East Coast right now is struggling a little bit. We haven't had the rain that they're expecting. Certainly when we were in Kentucky, you think of the Kentucky bluegrass, it was not blue. It was pretty brown. My daughter did a cross-country lesson out on the cross-country field there at the Kentucky Horse Park, which, I mean, like every kid's dream after watching the Discovery and 3-day event, right, is, can I gallop my pony up that hill on that grass? And, okay, it was kind of green, but there was a lot of dead grass there. They had not had the rain. And so the nutritional value in that is far lower. And so if you're relying on your pasture, it's not going to have the nutritional quality that it had perhaps back in April and May. And again, we can sometimes forget about that. So it's really a matter of really sitting back and looking at the big picture and trying to figure out, what is the cause of the weight loss? Is it a calories issue or is it something else?
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And in regards to the pasture, as you know, I mean, my ponies are all in muzzles and I am constantly trying to keep them from eating the pasture. But last year I had a drought and my pastures were in really poor shape. And I was, even with them being in muzzles, supplementing with hay. And this year we can't get the rain to stop. And my pastures, I mean, I'm mowing them down and trying to keep them under control because they're too good of quality. We have less time being out on them, even with the muzzles on. So I think that is, and you definitely, if you have pasture, you need to walk out into them and actually look how the pasture is doing and not just look across, because when you look across it, it may look green, but when you actually walk out there, you can see all the bare spots and, you know, what's actually growing.
That's so true. I think we're guilty of letting our horses go at the gate, right? And oftentimes our water troughs are pretty close to the gate for convenience as well. And so we may not be really walking out across our pastures as often as we should be and really looking down into them versus
we can do a whole
them.
episode on just pastures and pasture management. If you have ponies that don't come when they're called, you spend a lot of time walking across the pasture going to get them. So I get every day to go out there and see how they look when I'm getting them at the farthest end of the field.
Yeah, meanwhile, my guy is like, oh, rescue me from being out in this large open space. As soon as he sees me, he's like at the gate. Can you bring me in?
Exactly.
Yeah, we have very different horses.
So with all this heat across the country, on social media, there's been a lot of horse owners asking for recommendations for feed or supplements for weight gain. Is that something to add in the heat of the summer?
Yeah, I mean, there is this temptation, right, that, oh, my horse is losing weight. Quick Google, what can I do? And there's all these supplements out there with the word gain in the title, and most of them are fat supplements, right? Or to go to some higher, we think, oh, I need fat, my horse needs to gain weight. And these might help if the issue is a calorie problem, right? Because fat is really calorie dense. Like there's way more calories per gram of fat than there is in a gram of carbohydrate. So fat is really useful for getting calories into a diet because from the same weight of feed, you get significantly more calories. So the horse doesn't have to eat as much to significantly increase their calorie intake. So fat is very useful in the diet for that reason. But if it's not a calorie issue, like as we've talked about, if it's a gut health issue, then that supplement isn't going to be the right choice. There's also the issue of, there might be the temptation to kind of grab an oil for the same reason, right? Super high in calories, easy to feed, but some of them are not very stable in hot weather and can go rancid. So you have to be really careful about that. And that actually reminds me that I need to take my spare oil out of the feed room and bring it back into, I feed fish oil. And so I had a new bottle and I took it to the barn last night and I left it in the feed room where I don't want to leave it because it's not air conditioned. So yeah, that I keep back in the house and I just, as and when I need it, I take small quantities out so that there's only several days worth sitting out in the barn at a time and then I refill it. So, you know, heat is definitely not the friend of unstable oils, and a lot of our better quality oils are not particularly stable. So it may not be the best approach because if it goes rancid, now you've got oxidative byproducts in that oil and those are definitely not healthy for your horse. The better approach is to, as we've talked about, identify what the cause of the potential weight loss is and then fully evaluate the diet. Are you feeding enough forage? Are you feeding a forage that's digestible enough, right? So we were talking about your ponies and the fact that they're super easy keepers. And I know we're always talking about you needing a pretty stemmy, low nutritional value hay for your ponies over the winter so you can feed plenty of hay. But that that hay would not be the hay that I would feed my guy who really it's harder to keep weight on. For him, I need a hay that's more digestible, higher nutritional value. So now is a good time of year to, if you've got a performance horse that's losing weight, look at your hay quality. Maybe it's not a matter of increasing the number of pounds of hay you're feeding per day. Maybe it's more an issue of you need a better quality hay, something that's more easily digestible, that the horse can get more calories out of that hay with less kind of fermentation needed, so less heat will be generated. So there's a hay out there for everybody. And these performance horses, this is where your leafier, greener, less stemmy hays are really a better choice for them because they won't have to work so hard to get the nutrition out of it. So are you feeding enough forage? Are you feeding the right kind of forage? And then if you are feeding a commercial feed, are you feeding it correctly? Checking your feeding directions. Maybe there is room to increase your feed because you're not feeding it correctly. Or maybe you're feeding a balancer because during the winter your horse is a pretty easy keeper, or he's been a pretty easy keeper and he just got away with forage and a balancer, but now he's competing, traveling more, a little more stressed, working harder. Now actually he does need something that's a little more calorie dense, and you do need a performance feed, right? So maybe you do need to change your feed. And then if it's a gut health related issue, are the commercial feeds you're feeding, do they have ingredients in them to support gut health, right? Some feed companies out there use some really nice, well-researched ingredients like butyric acid and have really good sort of prebiotic packages in them to support gut health. Are those already in your feed, or do you need to find supplements that will have those in to help support your horse's gut health while they're stressed?
So after you just said all that, let's look at some specific scenarios of horses that, like, where you would start, what your approach would be. So for example, let's start with the horse that just is working harder. Like it's summer, they're showing, they're doing more lessons. Where do you start with that one?
Yeah, so if it's just a matter of inadequate calories, that's probably the easiest scenario to deal with, right? So we're going to make the assumption that ideally you're feeding at least 1.5% of body weight per day as forage, or your horse has access to really good quality free choice pasture. So the forage side of things is taken care of. And let's say you've been feeding a balancer and they've been maintaining their weight. You have a couple of options. You could just feed more hay, right? You could just say, okay, well, happy with the balancer and just need a few more calories. I'm going to increase their hay intake. So that would be the first way. And that's, let's be honest, would be my preferred way right out of the gate, because I always want to maximize the amount of forage that I'm feeding. If maybe you've got a horse that they're like maxed out on forage, they're not going to voluntarily eat more forage. My guy's a bit like that. You could keep more and more forage in front of him, doesn't mean to say he's going to eat it. So if you're in that kind of situation, or maybe you want a slightly different feel under saddle, you want a different type of energy, you want something that's not coming from sort of a slow release forage fermentation process, you want something a little more readily available to the horse, then you are looking at the more calorie dense performance type feeds. Now, the trick with those is that they typically have a feeding size of like at least 6 pounds a day for an average size horse, which is a pretty big jump from feeding, say, a pound of balancer. And you might sort of think, well, I really don't need to feed 6 pounds. Like, he's not that underweight. Like, hopefully he's only just started losing weight and you're trying to stop things from getting worse. So this is where you can kind of titrate your balancer against your performance feed, right? So if you don't need the minimum 6 pound serving size of the performance feed, let's say you just want 3 pounds of performance feed. If you just feed the 3 pounds of performance feed and remove your balancer completely, that diet's going to have some deficiencies in it because you're not feeding the performance feed properly. So in that situation, we would cut the balancer in half and feed, say, 1/2 pound of balancer and 3 pounds of the performance feed. And then if you crept up 4, 5, 6, when you get to the 6 pounds, you get rid of the balancer because you don't need it at that point because you're feeding the performance feed properly. So that's kind of where I would go with those harder working horses where it's probably just a calorie issue.
Let's say that you have the calorie side of things where they need to be, and it's due to travel and show or heat stress. How do you support those horses?
Yeah, so I think that's where the kind of targeted supplementation comes in, right? I mean, if you're showing and traveling a lot, I think there's a lot to be said for doing things like UlcerGuard, which is the sort of the preventative version of GastroGuard, which is an omeprazole medication that is approved for over-counter sale for the use of prevention of gastric ulcers. So I think that is certainly helpful for helping with obviously damage to the stomach. It's tricky if you're showing a lot. You can get to the point where they're kind of on that all the time, and it's not a medication that I really personally favor giving all the time, but that's something that you might want to discuss with your vet. But you do need to start it. A lot of people make the mistake that you do need to start it about 3 days before you're going to ship out to your event. It doesn't work immediately. It takes several days to really take effect, and it needs to be given on an empty stomach at least 30 minutes before a meal. So most of the time it's given in the morning, and then you have to wait at least 30 minutes before the horse gets its breakfast. So that's tricky if your horse lives on pasture or what have you, but you just have to kind of do the best of it you can. It was interesting to me because when we were in Kentucky, one of my daughter's teammates came with Gastrogard and gave the horse Gastrogard while it was shipping, but then they took it off Gastrogard while they were at the event and then put it back on Gastrogard to go home. And I felt like they sort of missed the point a little bit, that the actual being in a strange location at a show is also very stressful. It's not just the act of being in the trailer. So
yeah, they didn't understand the continued support that the horse still needed just from being in a whole new location.
Exactly. Like, yes, I know it lives in a stable at home and, it gets ridden an hour a day, and now it's in a stable in Kentucky and being ridden for an hour a day, but it's completely different and very stressful. So I would have kept doing that Ulcegard the entire time we were there. And actually, my daughter's pony did get Ulcegard the entire time we were there. We also did something called stress paste, and that's it's like a supplement, basically, right? It comes in a paste form, so it's really easy to administer, but it's a combination of prebiotics and amino acids that help support the gut lining. It's got some betaine in it, which helps with amino acid balance. It also helps counteract heat stress. Butyric acid, it's a volatile fatty acid that's actually made during the fermentation of forage. So this is a compound that the horse is naturally producing thanks to the bugs in its hindgut. But butyric acid is really useful to the lining of the intestinal tract. And there's some really interesting data showing that it actually helps mitigate the risk of what we call leaky gut syndrome. But what happens is when you get inflammation in the intestinal tract lining, is that it can start to kind of separate, right? And little cracks can appear. And in the worst scenario, they can actually come apart kind of completely. And we can end up with these gaps along the digestive tract where there shouldn't be. And this then allows compounds to pass through the gut in ways they shouldn't, right? So you could get, for example, proteins. Proteins should be broken down into their composite amino acids, and then the amino acids get absorbed through specific pathways into the cells of the lining, not between the cells of the lining, right? And so if you have a big gap between the cells of the lining, now instead of individual amino acids leaving, you could get like 3 or 4 amino acids joined together leaving. Like the gap is big enough that some pretty big things can get out of your digestive tract and into your bloodstream that shouldn't. And this is actually one of the things that could actually lead to allergic reactions, because you've actually now got proteins escaping the gut that are foreign to the horse, and the horse then has an immune response and says, what the heck is that in my bloodstream? Like, that is not meant to be here. Right? Because it should have been broken down even further into much smaller pieces, but it didn't have to be, because there are these holes that it escaped through. And so it really is not a good thing. So butyric acid helps maintain what we call tight junctions, the integrity of those cells and how they're joined together, and really helps keep those cells tightly adhered together so we don't have leaky gut. So butyric acid is, at this point, added to a number of the better quality feeds that are out on the market. So you may see that look at your ingredient lists on your feeds. You might see butyric acid listed. That's a great gut health ingredient for stress. We're starting to see things like chromium. There's some, research showing that is beneficial to horses that are facing stress. And some of that's being added to certain feeds as well. So looking for that on feed labels. So just looking at your ingredient lists, and then either it's in your feed or it's not in your feed, try to find a good quality supplement that you then might be able to top dress. And it might be a case of you kind of have a maintenance amount in the diet all the time. Hopefully, actually, you're feeding a good quality feed that actually has these ingredients in. And that's probably enough day to day when you're at home for everyday life. But then maybe like your horse, right? We know that when he goes places, he's getting this stuff in his diet day to day, but when he goes places, he might need a little extra help during those travel days and show days, because that added stress is a little more than his regular feed can handle. And so he's a candidate for getting a digestive health supplement added to his diet a few days before he ships, while he's at a show and when he first gets home, just to give him that additional support.
Great idea. I'll get with you about which one to provide.
Yeah. And I think it can be tempting to just throw the kitchen sink at everything, but you have to be a little bit strategic. And unfortunately with gut health, as we know from both the horses that we have, it's a little bit of trial and error as to what works and what doesn't, and what can help one horse may not always be the right product for the next horse. So, there are a number of really good products out there, and it may just be a matter of cycling through them. And if you try the first one and it doesn't work, look for something that approaches things in a slightly different way, and maybe that'll be the one that helps your horse.
So last horse we're going to talk about is, what about the horse that's going to the shows? They look great. They're performing well, but they need a little oomph. I think that's harder to figure out, because as horse owners, the horse is doing great, but we don't want to disrupt anything. We don't want to cause any issues, but we know they could use a little more energy.
Yeah, I think I hear that fairly often with clients, right? I just wish he had just a little bit more energy. And, one of the things I look at that might surprise people, I've definitely done diets at shows, and we've talked about how do you give your horse salt? Well, I use a salt block, and, I've looked in the stall and there's no salt block. And so I say, well, are you putting salt in his bucket feed while he's at the show? Well, no. Okay, so you only use a salt block at home, and then you brought him to the show and now he has no salt. And meanwhile, he's sweating those 3 days. It's pretty warm out. So the problem with that is that we need, sodium is really important for muscle contraction. Electrolytes are really important for nerve function. So if your horse is mildly dehydrated, I remember years ago now, I wish I could find the reference for it, but it was an article written in a popular equine magazine in the UK called Horse and Hound. And it was noted in there by a well-regarded exercise physiologist that for every percent dehydration, your horse loses 4% performance. And if we think about that skin pinch test that we do to check for dehydration, where you grab the skin on the shoulder and let it go, and it should just ping right back. And if it doesn't ping right back, they're dehydrated. It's not until the horse is 5 or 6% dehydrated that skin is going to remain tented. Okay, so if you're losing 4% performance for every percent dehydration, and it's not easy to tell your horse is dehydrated until they're about 5% dehydrated, you've potentially lost 20% of your performance.
That's a lot.
That's huge, right? So making sure that your horses are getting, especially in the summer, getting adequate electrolyte replenishment is really important for performance. And horses that are running out of oomph, especially towards the end of a show, it's quite possible that they've been sweating, working harder than they do at home, and we haven't been replenishing the electrolytes adequately, and that by the last day, they're just a little dehydrated. And I don't know about you, but when I'm a little dehydrated, I'm a little fuzzy-headed. I'm not thinking super clearly. It would be hard, I think, and this is anthropomorphizing, right? But I think it would be hard as a horse to be able to judge the height of a fence adequately. It's not surprising to me if they're mildly dehydrated that they might have a rail every now and again.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Whenever I'm dehydrated, I feel so sluggish. I'm just, I don't want to do anything. So to go out and try and perform,
right?
I'm sure it's very hard.
Right, or you miss your flying change, right? If you're a dressage rider, you got a line of tempies or whatever, and they're just a little behind your leg, and so things are just slightly off, right? The timing of things is not quite where it needs to be, right? So it may actually not be an issue of having to change the feed. So I would always encourage people, make sure that your electrolyte balance is where it needs to be. These horses that seem to be doing great, looking well, performing pretty well, it still can be stress, right? Stress looks differently in different horses. They don't all become neurotic and stop eating, and some of them become a little more shut down, and they just can't handle any more stress. And so you put your leg on and you ask for something, and they just can't, right? It's more than they can handle, but they're good guys and girls, and they want to do the job, and so they do the best they can. They're just a little behind your leg and just a little resigned and don't have that sparkle, and that can be stress too. So don't rule out stress, even if it's not obvious, right, that it's stress. And then there are times where with certain performance horses, I will play around with where the calories are coming from. If we're relying on fat, we know that fat is sort of a slower release, calmer kind of energy. There's some research to support that. Maybe if you've got one of these like super calm, quiet horses that you just need a little more fire, especially as they go up the levels. I kind of hear that, especially from my dressage riders, right? They all get to sort of 4th level pre-St. George. They just want a little more horse.
Right.
Those tests start getting really long and they're hard. The tests are hard. Then maybe it is worth try substituting some of that fat, for example, with a little more starch. And I know that sounds very kind of like, what? You're going to feed starch? But starch has kind of gotten this like bad press and a bit of a dirty word in equine nutrition, but it has its place, right? It has its place. So it may be that you have a horse that actually needs a little bit more starch. So it may be just tweaking the type of performance food that you're feeding, and maybe it's getting something that has a bit more starch or what have you. So that's where working with a nutritionist can really help you kind of dial that kind of thing in and see if that would help that particular horse.
Well, that's all the time we have. Before we go, what do you think the most important takeaways are for feeding performance horses in the summer?
Yeah, I think, I think the theme of this episode has really been that stress, right? Stress really affects these horses. And there are things we can do nutritionally to try and mitigate the effects of that stress in order to help them be the healthiest, happiest, best performers they can be. And I think that many things that we don't appreciate sometimes how stressful some of the situations we put horses in are and what that's doing to the digestive tract. As I said at the very beginning of the episode, like we have research showing that trailering your horses for multiple hours can quite dramatically change the makeup of their microbiome bacterial population and the diversity of that bacterial population. And that can take a week to normalize. So the things we're doing with our horses are having pretty dramatic consequences to their digestive tracts. And I think we need to think about that. And we need to think about how we can, all the things we can do to try and help mitigate that stress and the effect it's having. It's not only just going to be better for your horse's health and well-being, but they're also then going to be able to perform better for us. So it's a win-win all around.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com. For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.